Historians, and welcome to our next lesson in our Nazi Germany topic. In this lesson we are thinking about the economic problems that the new Weimar government faced, and in particular thinking about unrest and hyperinflation. A couple of learning intentions for this one. We want to be able to describe why hyperinflation happened in 1923 in Germany, because it was a really huge part of what later would lead to extremist groups getting more attention and more focus, and we want to be able to explain what the impact of hyperinflation was actually in Germany. And as you can see from these pictures here, it might give you a little bit of an indication about what that actually was. So if you think about this picture in particular down at the bottom corner, consider what these things are that these kids and this random dog is playing with, and we will come back to think about that again later on in the lesson. So wherever you're taking your notes, put this as a heading please, and continue with the lesson. So first of all, obviously when we talk about any sort of glossary word, and there is a glossary for the full topic in the team, if you haven't managed to download that, you should definitely do that, but economy is the kind of main focus for what we're talking about here. So when we refer to economy, what we really mean is the wealth of a country in terms of the amount of goods that they produce and how many goods that they consume. So the economy is pretty much how much money a country actually has. And if you think about after 1918 and after the end of the First World War, and we're thinking about why Germany wasn't actually in a particularly wealthy situation, you can start to think about why their economy would not have been in a good place. After any sort of world event where there is disruption to the kind of production of materials or the imports and exports of materials, you tend to find that there's an economic slump of some kind. And Germany obviously had a very serious one after 1918. So after the war, the German economy was pretty much in ruins. It had cost roughly about $38 million to actually pay for the war that they had obviously lost. A lot of the factories had been destroyed during combat and things like that, which meant that they were actually unable to produce the goods that could have helped their economy recover. They then get hit with this reparation bill of £6.6 billion to the Allies, which is almost impossible for them to actually pay. So by 1922, Germany had pretty much failed to kind of recover economically. And as a result of that, they had not managed to pay these reparation instalments that they were being told to pay by the Treaty of Versailles on time. So they'd actually managed to fail to pay 33 out of 36 of the payments up to that point. France, believing that Germany was choosing not to pay, instead of couldn't pay because of their economic situation, decided that they were going to force their hand a little bit here, and they were going to take action against Germany. So they, along with Belgium, decided to march about 60,000 troops into Germany and to seize control of an area of Germany where a lot of this production was actually happening, with the idea that they would keep control of it until these kind of lapsed payments had been made. So kind of like acting like repo men, repossessing these payments by taking over these areas of Germany. Now, we're thinking about why Germany was actually unable to pay at this point, and there's actually a couple of reasons for this. So what you're going to do is you're going to set up a mind map, a grid with these headings, or even just put the main heading in the bubble and then some information for each of these bits of heading, and we're going to put some information from the next couple of slides into it. So we're going to talk about the soldiers, the Allied blockade, the Treaty of Versailles, the final sum that they had to pay, and the industrial production, and all of these things contributed to why Germany was unable to pay. So pause the video for a couple of seconds, make sure you've got it set up the way you want to take your notes for it, and then continue with the next couple of slides. So the first one that we're filling in is soldiers. So we're just looking for a really quick bit of information from the information that is actually on the slide, and we're just going to highlight that in a wee bit of detail. So basically what happened with the soldiers are these men obviously came back from the front line. They weren't needed to be soldiers anymore, and they wanted jobs. God forbid that they should want jobs in their own country after they'd fought for it, but they wanted jobs. The reality was the jobs weren't there, because a lot of the jobs that they had done before the war no longer existed, or the factories that they had worked in, or even the ones they now could work in, had actually been destroyed. Also, quite a lot of the things that they could have maybe done, they weren't allowed to do any longer because these things had closed down as a result of the treaty and other things as well. So basically the jobs weren't there for them. This meant unemployment was actually really, really high in Germany, and a lot of that was kind of the focus of the government rather than the spending towards the reparations. But also it meant that there were not as many workers in these factories to actually produce a lot of goods to try and get the economy back on track. So any money they did have was going towards other things, and they didn't have enough to actually pay the reparation payments. Okay, next heading, Allied blockade. The Allied blockade actually continued until 1919, so despite the fact that the war had ended in 1918 on the Armistice Day, they didn't actually remove the blockade until after the treaty had been signed. And this meant that things like foods and other products and medicines and things like that didn't get in, like we've already talked about, and a lot of people died from starvation and the Spanish flu epidemic that pretty much went right through Europe at this point in time. So this means that there is actually less people to work in certain areas, and it also means that they're having to spend the money that they do have on keeping their people alive rather than actually spending it on the reparation payments. The Treaty of Versailles itself, big problem in 1919, it deprived Germany of 75% of its iron ore resources and 15% of its arable land. So they basically didn't have one of the major resources that they needed to produce materials or produce goods that they could then export and work with to stabilise the economy, and they also had actually lost a good portion of their farmland as well. So that was a serious problem for them and resulted in them being unable to pay. The fact that the final reparation sum of money was 6.6 million was quite a heavy burden for Germany. It was a lot of money for them to actually try to pay back, which meant that they weren't actually able to pay this at all. Even after they denounced this, Britain was quite keen for them not to have such a heavy sort of bill, because they didn't think economically they could pay for it, and they did want Germany to recover economically to be a trading partner in future. So we're just going to say that when it was announced in 1921, even though they were told they had to pay it, the final total wasn't announced till 1921. It placed a really heavy burden on the economy, and ultimately it couldn't actually continue to meet that particular demand. Final heading, the industry was all geared towards war production. So when the war obviously ended, there was actually not many goods being produced that could then be sold elsewhere, not so much to be actually made in terms of making money for the economy, so there was less money in Germany in general at this point in time, which is quite common after wars. But obviously if you have a 6.6 million bill over your head, it is not a good situation for you to be in. So make sure you go back through these, put a wee bit of information in each bit of your bubbles on your mind map or your grid or in your list, whatever you've decided to do, and then continue the lesson from roughly about 8 minutes and 55 seconds. So France and Belgium not happy that these payments haven't been made. They're not believing that these causes that we've just talked about are real. They don't believe Germany can't actually afford to pay. They are convinced that they're choosing not to pay, and so they invade. The question is where. So January 1923, they invade an area just up from the Rhineland. Okay, it's called the Ruhr. It was Germany's industrial heartland at this point in time. It roughly made about 80% of Germany's steel and 70% of its coal production. Now, France and Belgium basically wanted to seize the steel and the coal production as compensation. So instead of the payments being made, they seized this as compensation instead. It's basically right next to the Rhineland, which was, remember, demilitarised in the Treaty of Versailles, which meant there was no German soldiers actually stopping them. They were able to just walk right through. So Belgium's here, in this corner. France is here. This is the Rhineland in the pink, and this green bit here is the Ruhr. Pretty much what they did was these two groups just marched straight through the Rhineland, nothing to stop them, because remember, Treaty of Versailles had said no German soldiers are allowed to be in the Rhineland. It's a buffer zone between France and Germany to protect France from invasion, and so France and Belgium decide to invade Germany. A little bit ironic, but there you go. And this is where they invade this region here. So pretty much these parts in green are where all of this, well, not all of, but a majority of the steel and the coal that is the main source of economic stability in Germany is being produced. So by invading this to try and seize this compensation, Germany's economy more or less is under direct assault from these foreign invaders, and that is a problem. Ultimately, what happened? The workers went on strike. It was known as passive resistance. However, this was a problem because it meant when when France and Belgium got into the Ruhr region of Germany and they told the workers, you will work for us to now get this compensation, the workers said no. They just refused to do it. So they went on strike, and it was a problem because during this striking period, there was no goods being produced in this region, which was a serious dent to an already very, very damaged economy, and it meant that Germany was no longer creating any wealth. So the Weimar government decided that the only thing they actually could do to try and keep things going was to print money to pay the striking workers. Now, in addition, once the strike is actually called off in September, all of the profits that they actually would have made would be given to France and Belgium, and this continued until 1925. So it became a problem because not only were they on strike and not producing the goods, but the government starts to produce more money. They start to just print more paper money, and that's going to become important in a second. But on top of that, they don't actually leave. They do seize this compensation until 1925, which means that even after we've dealt with this crisis, which is about to happen, it doesn't actually go away until they stop actually taking this profit back. As a result of this, the Weimar Republic just continued to print more and more money. They need money to pay for people, but they don't actually have the money to back it up. They don't have the wealth to back up the money. So this cartoon that we saw at the start sums up the reaction. If you think about what it shows a German worker. He has his hands in his pocket, and we've got these invaders. They are pointing, pretty much telling him, get back to work, you. And he has dropped his pickaxe on the floor, put his hands in his pockets, and he's saying, no, I'm not working. So this kind of is showing this idea of the passive resistance that they had in place at this point. So, quick activity to kind of summarise what we've talked about. We've got some anagrams and a wee box to kind of help you here. Okay, so you're going to just copy this as a wee summary into your jotter, onto your notes. It tells you kind of what happened. So in 1923, soldiers from, and that one's France, and Belgium invaded the Ruhr region, the industrial heartland of Germany. The reason for this invasion was to make Germany pay reparations faster. Instead, workers in the Ruhr went on strike, and the German economy collapsed as they weren't producing goods. So pause this, use the boxes to help you, write out the summary, and then move on to the next part of the lesson. So here's kind of what happened next, and you can draw this in if you want into your notes, or you can just have a look at it. So Germany failed to make the reparation payments. The French and the Belgians invade the Ruhr. The German workers call out on strike, but the government continues to print money. And as this goes on continuously, they print more and more and more and more. And this leads to what we refer to as the hyperinflation crisis. Again, in terms of glossary words, hyperinflation is basically the sudden collapse in the value of money, but at the same time an increase in the price of goods. So there's a video clip for you to watch here, which I will link in the team. So pause the video at 15 and 15, go away and watch that clip, and then come back and take notes while you're watching about what actually happened to the people during hyperinflation, and we'll go back from that there. So actually pause the video at 15 and 30 seconds, watch the first video and come back. So hopefully you were able to see the video, or that you've gone away and watched it. If you haven't, please pause this one and click it, it's in the playlist, and see what's going on, and think about what you can actually see happening in this picture here. So this is the one from the start of the lesson, on this side, and then we've got another one here. Basically, these piles and these bundles that these children are playing with, and the ones that these children have made this kite out of, is actually not just paper. They are bundles of money, official money that has been printed by the government. And it became actually so useless that what tended to happen is that the money became utterly worthless, and instead of actually spending it because things were worth too much and the money was worth too little, they gave it to the children to play with. So in some occasions, actually what ended up happening is that because they couldn't afford coal or even logs or oil for their heating or for cooking with, the money was actually so worthless that they burnt the paper money instead for heat and for warmth, because all of these bundles couldn't even buy a couple of lumps of coal for this particular fireplace, or enough wood or any coal like that to actually furnace this sort of cooker. So the money was actually burnt instead. In some places, people's entire life fortunes were actually so worthless that what they did was they used it to wallpaper. So this is actually money that they're wallpapering with, on top of newspaper, to try and keep a wee bit of heat in. You can see that people just abandoned their wages and things in the streets, and they were actually able to use brooms and things like that to clean up, because they had to get rid of so much of this just worthless paper money. In some places, people used it as notebooks. Some places it was used as toilet roll. Generally speaking, it was literally no longer worth anything. It was just paper. So to give you an idea of what kind of inflation looks like, obviously, if you think about something really simple, like a Freddo sweetie, okay, because that's the one that a lot of people know about. A Freddo sweetie used to be, say, about 10 pence so many years ago. And slowly over time, the amount of money that a Freddo sweetie costs has gone up. And we call this inflation, if at the same time the value of our money to pay for it goes down, that leads to something like hyperinflation. Because where you would maybe have to buy a Freddo bar and hand over a £1 coin 1 week, in a hyperinflation situation, what might happen is when you buy the same Freddo bar the next week, you have to hand over 2 coins, because those 2 coins are now worth the same as the 1 coin was the week before. 3 weeks later, you have to hand over 3 coins, because again, it's worth the same as the 2 weeks before that, and so on and so on. So the way this kind of looks is like this. 1913, before the war, a loaf of bread in Germany cost, say, the equivalent of 30 pence. To buy 1 egg, it costs you 10 pence. A kilogram of butter costs you £2.70. A kilogram of beef costs you £1.80. And to buy a pair of shoes for a child, it costs you £12. By the summer of 1923, these same items cost this much. So to buy a loaf of bread, it cost you £1,200. To buy an egg, it cost you £5,000. To buy the butter, it cost you £26,000. Now, obviously it's not pounds, it's marks that they used at this point in time, but those numbers are kind of a similar sort of idea. To buy beef, it cost you £18,800. To buy a pair of shoes, you may as well just go barefoot. And that is really, really a lot, because it is still the same item that you're buying, but the amount that you're having to hand over, because each note or each coin is worth less, goes up. By the end of the winter 1923, after this invasion, those prices have gone up again. So to buy your loaf of bread, 10 years after it cost you 30 pence, you are now paying 70 million. To buy your 10 pence egg, it is now 80 million. If you want your butter, it's 6 billion. If you want your kilogram of beef, it's 5.6 billion. If you want your pair of shoes, you may as well just completely go barefoot. Basically what we're saying is the overall kind of amount of inflation, the percentage that things went up, was about 4,000% over the course of that 10-year period, because of the situation with the economy and because of the invasion of the Ruhr. So basically what this kind of would work like is this. So July 1914, a pound is the equivalent of 20 marks. So if you hand a pound over and you're going to Germany, you get 20 marks back, exchange. By January 1919, a pound is worth 35 marks, so there is a little bit of a difference there. By January 1920, a pound is worth 256 marks. By 1921, it's worth the same, which is a bit like, okay. By January 1922, a pound is worth 764 marks, make a pound. By January 1923, 71,888 marks is the equivalent to a British pound. By September 1923, that many marks is the equivalent to a pound. By October 1923, and by the end of November 1923, that's how many marks is the equivalent of a pound. So hyperinflation became a serious problem for Germany. So in 1918, price of a loaf of bread cost just over half of a mark. By 1922, it had risen to 163 marks for the loaf of bread. By November 1923, it was 201,000 million marks for the same loaf of bread. That's what hyperinflation did to Germany. More or less, people just couldn't afford anything. There's some really interesting stories about how the people were affected by this. So one woman in a Christian centre helping the poor, she talks about a widow of a policeman. And she talks about the story saying the widow of a policeman was left with 4 children. She had been awarded 3 months' worth of her husband's salary when he died. By the time she got the money, the amount that she got, 3 months' worth of salary, was only enough for her to buy 3 boxes of matches. German writer going into a restaurant, he says of his time in hyperinflation in Germany, one day I dropped into a cafe to have a coffee. As I went in, I noticed the price was 5,000 marks, which was just about what I had in my pocket. I sat down, read my paper, drank my coffee, and spent altogether about an hour in the cafe. And then I asked for the bill. The waiter duly presented me with a bill for 8,000 marks. Why was it 8,000 marks, I asked. The mark had dropped in the meantime, I was told. So I gave the waiter all the money I had, and he was generous enough to leave it at that. So basically what this meant was that sometimes the price of something would go up while you were actually drinking that coffee. The mark has fallen and the price of it has gone up to try and be similar. To make the same amount of money, they have to actually charge more because the money itself is worth less. So how were German people affected by hyperinflation? And this is a key point that we need to take a note of. Okay, so put that as a heading. And the short answer is each group of people was affected differently. So what you're going to do is you're going to draw this table into your jotter or put these headings, and you're going to look at each of the groups: the workers, the middle class, the rich businessmen, and the unemployed and the pensioners, and you're going to think about how they were affected each time and if they supported the Weimar Republic. So pause the video, draw the table out, and then use the next couple of slides to fill in some details. So the working class. Initially, the working class suffered little compared to others because they still had jobs and earned a daily wage. The trade unions also fought for workers' rights and ensured that wages kept pace with the rising prices, so the wages had to continue to go up. But as things got worse, it was impossible to do this. Some workers actually had to be paid twice or 3 times a day as the price of goods increased hourly. Wives and children would wait outside to be handed the money as it was being paid to their husbands or their fathers, and then they would run to the shop and get as much food as they could for the money they had before the prices went up again. So for example, if a worker's daily wage increased from 50 marks to 60 marks, they had an extra 10 marks. But the price of bread rose 10 times, so 1 mark basically to 10. So for every 10 they got, it went up by another 1 for that particular loaf of bread. This happened with all items, and it meant that ordinary people found it really hard to buy food to feed their families, and a lot of people were faced with starvation when prices started to become ridiculous. Eventually, the value of money was so out of control that workers had to start to collect their wages in suitcases for their daily wage, because it was so much notes that they couldn't fit it in their pockets. They had to bring suitcases to collect it. And there's an interesting story of one person in particular who left their suitcase unattended, went into a shop to get something, realised they'd left it outside, and when they came out, they found that someone had stolen the suitcase and left a big pile of money behind, because the suitcase was actually worth more than the money was. So pause it here, look for some just key points for how the working class were affected, and note that down in your table. As a result, many started to support communism. Okay, so for the last column, they were really unhappy with the Weimar Republic. There were a lot of communist rebellions happening, especially in the Rhineland at this point in time. So the working class start to fall away from the Weimar Republic as their supporters. For the middle class, they suffered really badly under hyperinflation. They had worked really hard to put savings in the bank, but now all of their savings were utterly worthless. So obviously, if you need 32 billion marks to buy a pair of shoes, if you have saved that amount, that's it, that's all you can get. Obviously, they are on monthly salaries, and they became worthless and had to be negotiated daily as well. And a lot of them were forced to sell their valuables like jewellery and things like that just to buy food. However, not all middle classes actually suffered. If you had big bank loans, you benefited because you could pay back what your debt was really, really easily. And there's a really good story of one man in particular who borrowed money to buy a herd of cattle that he was starting on a new farm. And then hyperinflation hits. But soon after, he manages to sell one cow, and the amount of money he makes off of that cow is enough to pay back how much he actually owns because of hyperinflation. Farmers, they could also rely on their land to grow foods and things for themselves, so they were able to stave off kind of the worst effects of the hyperinflation, not all of them obviously. Plus everybody really needed food, and they had to buy it from the farmers. However, a problem for the farmers was that fertiliser went through the roof. So a lot of what they managed to actually keep hold of, they had to then spend just to keep themselves balanced. So fill in some information, some key facts about the middle class, and then come back for the next column bit. Basically, the middle classes lost faith in the Weimar Republic. If they couldn't keep Germany safe and secure, then they would vote for someone that could. And this is where parties, extremist parties like the Nazis, start to become more important. So fill that in your last column for the middle classes and then move on to the next group. So rich and business people then, if you owned property and didn't face the fear of being evicted and increasing rents, you were fine. If you had money in foreign banks, you're not so badly affected because you could get really good exchange rates for the money you had. It was also really easy to buy a business for virtually nothing because a lot of them were going bankrupt, and a lot of businessmen made a lot of money in the long term by doing this. And again, like we said, paying off loans becomes much easier because the amount loan did not increase, but the income that the businessmen received from selling their goods did, so they were able to pay off their loans more quickly. However, shopkeepers found it almost impossible to make money unless they could spend their takings on new supplies immediately. They would be unable to restock their shops with goods, and a lot of them had to go out of business. A lot of shopkeepers shut completely or opened just as little as possible to try and preserve their goods. For them, they did not support the Weimar Republic. They missed having a strong leader in the Kaiser or the government, and they then started to back extremist groups like the Nazis in things like the beer hall putsch, which we saw in Rise of Evil. They start to back these people who are promising solutions, and they really want it quite quickly. So pause the video, make sure you fill in this group, and then move on to the next one for your table. The unemployed then, not good for them. Elderly people as well as disabled and the unemployed were all living on fixed incomes or benefits and pensions, which meant they always got the same amount each week. They couldn't negotiate this. This is what they got, and they were really affected as a result. Prices were rising fast, so they could afford less and less until they could not afford the basics like food and fuel at all for heating their homes, and their income pretty much becomes worthless. One woman, a good story is that she sold her house with the intention of using the money to live on in her old age, but after a few weeks the money wasn't even enough for her to buy a loaf of bread, and she ended up living in poverty, destitute. If they were renting, they were evicted because they couldn't keep up with the increasing prices, and there became a lot of beggars living in the streets in Germany at this point in time. The massive rise in the cost of things like meat meant many starved, meant many starved as a result of this, and starvation was a serious concern. Due to severe poverty, there was outbreaks of looting and robbing and mugging because people were just stealing just to survive, and basically they struggled to survive. So this meant they lost all confidence in the government completely and turned to more extremist groups like the Nazis. So fill in this group for the unemployed and then move on. So the kind of bottom line is that it wasn't all negative. Some people did make their fortunes, like the man with his herd of cattle. People on wages were safe because they could renegotiate every day, but the pensioners on the fixed incomes and the people with savings were the most badly hit. And we saw the story about the woman and the loaf of bread. However, there was an end in sight and a kind of light at the end of the tunnel for them. So from the end of 1923, the Weimar government was actually able to bring the situation back under control. A lot of this was due to the efforts of Gustav Stresemann, which is this guy here. Stresemann pretty much ordered the factories to get back to work. He took over as minister and he said, right, you get back to work. He sold goods abroad to earn money to bring into the economy. He borrowed money from America to pay the reparations, which we refer to as the Dawes Plan, and we'll come back to this in a wee bit more detail later on. And he abolished the mark. He decided they were going to just stop printing. They'd printed so much and this money was so useless now, and the numbers had become ridiculous, that they were just going to get rid of it altogether. And he introduced a new currency that Germany was going to use, the Rentenmark, and this got rid of basically the useless paper money because you could no longer use it. It meant that they were starting basically from scratch, which was a very, very difficult thing to do, and it was actually a really interesting move. The consequences for this. Many people were angry that the invasion of the Ruhr had actually happened in the first place. They were annoyed that Stresemann had called off the passive resistance, and the fact that he had actually agreed to repay the reparations in order to get the French and the Belgian troops out of the Ruhr so that he could actually get them back to work, because he felt like that he had surrendered. And this is another example, as far as the people are aware, of the Weimar government being people that are stabbing Germany in the back, surrendering to the enemy. Many said that the Weimar government basically had allowed the country to be ruined from 1918's armistice, 1919's Treaty of Versailles, printing all this money, encouraging the passive resistance to continue, and then calling it off but not actually getting rid of the invaders. The rich had lost their savings, the poor became even more impoverished, and many people then turned their backs on the democracy that had just started in Germany and looked to the extremist groups like the Nazi Party, amongst others, to solve the issues. Hitler and the Nazi Party at this point in time are starting to promise they will fix the situation, and if the Weimar government are not willing or able to do it, then the people are going to vote for the ones that will. And that's where we start to see more people focused on the extremists. But we'll come back to that in more detail. So, assignment question for this particular lesson is this how fully question about the effects of hyperinflation. You should finish this and upload it to the assignment tab for this lesson. And if you have any questions or concerns or anything you want to double check, then feel free to put a message in the team or email your teacher. Definitely double check that you have completed the tasks, because it will make it easier, and then do this lesson's assignment.